What is up, my friends and fellow busy bees? So I wanted to try something different on the podcast today that, if you enjoy it, I would love to make a regular series. So please let me know how you like today's episode. But I wanted to integrate more just kind of casual education and helping you see inside like my day-to-day life and what the projects that I'm working on look like. And I wanted to walk you through one of my recent custom refinishing projects that I did for a client and just walk you through the whole process from beginning to end. Hopefully, if you are someone who offers this as well, you might pick up some tips and tricks along the way and just see kind of like what that looks like. This is also, if I'm being honest, just a low-key, really easy thing I can do because I don't have to prep for this. I can just think back and walk you through the project. So, slightly selfish and self-serving, but I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. So today I want to talk about the most recent custom project that got picked up from the shop, which was actually a dining table that I had worked on. And you may have seen this if you follow me on Instagram. I had posted about it periodically. It's MelDidItHerself on Instagram. If you're not already hanging out with me there, go check it out. But it was this beautiful, large dining table that had two leaves that were put into it, and it was something like 100 inches long, I want to say, once it was fully extended. So very long, longer than my dining table for sure. And so it was a veneer top, but the legs themselves were solid wood. Took a look at it, figured out that it was a veneer. So that was very helpful information to know right from the get-go because that was going to impact how I treated the piece as well, because veneer is such a thin piece of wood that I didn't want to be blowing through that and gouging any holes into this dining table. So I'll take you to the very beginning. So this was actually a custom that came about in a way that they don't typically come about because I have a custom intake form, but this was actually a friend who reached out on Facebook Messenger and was just like, hey, we're moving in the next few months. We have this huge dining table that I got from this place that I work at. They were just going to get rid of it, and so I snagged it, but I'd love for it to look like this, and sent over some kind of inspiration photos. And so the table at that time had a very red hue to it. It had, you could see some nice like wood grain kind of peeking out from under the finish, but it had one of those really thick plasticky looking factory finishes over the top. And the inspiration photos she sent were very dark, basically like black, stained woods, very modern, very sleek, clean lines like the piece already had, which was great because that's one thing that I always take note of when clients are sending me inspiration photos is like if it has a very different shape or I want to say vibe, but like style based on the shape, like that is different from the piece that they're actually bringing to me. I like to always point out the fact that we can use this color tone or the stain color and all that stuff as an inspiration, but at the end of the day, we're working with the shape of the piece and whatever wood species is under this finish. So just be willing for it to look slightly different and for us to have to maybe pivot it a bit to make it look best for this piece. I like to make those kind of things very apparent early on, just because I don't want anybody's expectations to be so high that they're just not realistic and they don't end up satisfied with the piece in the end. And I like to keep things transparent and open throughout the process. So she reached out, she sent me over some photos of the piece, the measurements, the dimensions, which are always things that I'm looking to get from someone, and then basically said, I trust whatever you think we should do to it based on these inspo pics. I have a lot of time as well that I don't need the piece until, so if you're able to take it in, do it at your leisure, and then we'll pick it up kind of when we move into the house, that will work perfect. So I sent her over what the estimate would be for the project based on the parameters that were provided, and she said, sounds good. I sent her over a timeline of when I could take the piece in based on other projects that I had lined up that would be taking up space in the workshop because I knew this would take up a good chunk of my workshop because it was so big, and we set that up. So once I took the piece in, it was in great shape. I did notice that on the edges along kind of basically the seam of where you would be seeing the veneer meet the MDF that was underneath it, there was kind of like edge banding, but it was plastic along the outside. So I did point that out to them and basically said, this won't sand down to a wood finish, so I won't be able to stain it in the same way, but I can use just a black paint on this one strip and it will just kind of seamlessly blend in and you won't really notice it all that much, which they were totally fine with. So I first got started on cleaning the entire piece. I typically use a TSP solution, or most often now I'm using Fusion's TSP alternative, just a little less chemically, and it works great. It's very concentrated, so you just put like a cap full into a large bucket so it lasts a really long time. And what that does is it cleans the piece, it degreases the piece, especially for a dining room table. It's getting a lot of wear and tear. There's often a lot of dirt and grime that you can't see to the naked eye, so want to make sure that you're very thoroughly cleaning that, because if you don't get it off, it's going to make your paint or your stain not adhere well, not act the way that it is intended to. And if you are going to be sanding the piece, it's going to really gum up that sandpaper if you are going in prior to cleaning it all off thoroughly. So I gave everything a thorough cleaning. I let it dry completely before I got started on it. And I decided to actually do this in kind of 2 different stages because of the sheer size of this table. It was much larger than my workshop bench, so I opted to put the leaves to the side and work on just the table itself, and then work on the leaves after the fact, so I could basically move one out of the workshop first. So I decided, because this was a veneer, I did not want to use an electric sander. I didn't want to possibly blow through it, especially since we were going to be staining this piece. I didn't want to take any chances. I can get a little crazy with my electric sander on the edges of veneer and blow through it more often than I like to admit. So I grabbed my handy dandy carbide scraper, and this worked really great. I was sweating profusely. It was a great workout, but again, that thick kind of plasticky factory finish really made me work for it. Now, I could have used a stripper. I actually, after the fact, after I was finished with this project, Stripwell sent me their QCS stripper, and that would have probably lifted up the finish really nicely. So now I know for next time, but I don't mind using the scraper and just kind of breaking it up into a few different sessions so that I have a break and I'm giving my muscles and my body a break. And this was actually a table with a bit of a starburst pattern to it. Why that was important was because I want to always be scraping in the direction of the wood grain. And so for your typical dresser top, it's going to be probably the wood grain running from the left to the right of the piece. And so you're always wanting to be going with the grain and not against that grain, because you might get chipping in the wood, you might not get the full finish off, and you definitely won't get the finish off as easily as you would if you're going in the direction of the wood. So that's a tip if you're using a carbide scraper. And so with this starburst pattern, I just made sure to always be rotating the direction in which I was scraping the finish off to go in that starburst shape. And I got it nicely scraped down. It was looking so beautiful. The veneer was way nicer than it was looking through the factory finish they had on it, which was awesome. And then once I had that all scraped away, I just wanted to really even out the veneer and make sure that everything was gone off of it so that it would absorb the stain really consistently and I wouldn't see any patchiness, or maybe somewhere where that sleek finish was still remaining. So I went through with my Surf Prep sander. It's their 3x4 electric ray sander, so it is smaller. However, it's not an orbital sander. An orbital sander is moving and rotating, so it's really going to eat through the finish that it is on quite quickly, which is not what I wanted, again, because this is a veneer. So I used my 3x4 and I think I used probably maybe 150 grit and went along all of the tabletop and sides, again, moving in the direction of the wood grain, and just made sure I got everything smoothed out, and then went in with 220 grit just to really smooth things out. But again, I'm not trying to really get anything out of there. I'm not trying to remove any of the wood per se. I'm just trying to make sure everything is nice and smooth and even and ready to take on that stain. I also went through on that edge that I had mentioned that was more of a plasticky finish, and I scraped off what I could of the kind of plasticky finish just so it was roughed up and not so sleek, so that would avoid any chipping in the future. And then I again just sanded it to prep it for the paint that I would be putting on it. Before I went in with any stain, I did do the painting of that edge. So I went in actually first priming. So I did 2 layers of primer, and for this project I used Fusion Mineral Paints Ultra Grip, and this is one of the first times I've actually used this product. To be honest, I was a little bit footloose and fancy free with this custom and tried out a couple new products, which I definitely wouldn't recommend doing if you can help it. because if that product doesn't perform the way that you're used to and you're giving it to a client's piece and you're on a timeline and things like that, it's probably not like the best idea. But in this case, I knew the person and I knew that we had the flexibility of a lot of time should things not go to plan. So I tried out a couple of products that I wasn't super used to using, but I do know and trust the brand. I use Fusion products all the time with their paint and stuff, so I felt good about it, but just a word to the wise. Don't be doing too much experimenting when you're doing your custom work. Stick to the tried and true products, and then in your free time when you're working on your own projects, you can try out the different fun products that exist out there. Okay, so I went through and put 2 layers of that Ultra Grip on, letting them dry thoroughly in between each layer. As always, I highly recommend reading the directions for any product that you're using, particularly when it's a new product to you, to make sure that you are applying it in the way that they recommend, that you are wearing the proper safety equipment to protect yourself from said product, and waiting the proper amount of drying time and looking at the recoat times as well if you're going to have to go in with another product after that to make sure that everything is cured enough and dry enough to be putting more products on afterwards, because if not, you're going to get a horrible finish. So once that was primed, I decided to go in and stain the piece, and I wanted to get started on this part first because I knew I was probably going to need to do a few layers of stain to get the dark black, almost opaque look that the client had sent me in the inspiration photos. And so I first went out and got the Minwax oil-based stain in the color Ebony, because that was the darkest color in their color palette. That is the stain that I typically use, that or Varathane ones, most often for my furniture makeovers. I prefer an oil-based stain. It's just what I'm used to. Gel stains are nice and I've used them in the past and they've performed well as well, but I just don't typically think to use it. Before applying that stain, I used a pre-stain or a wood conditioner to act basically as a primer for the wood so that it was well moisturized and it wouldn't absorb too much of the stain too fast and then get a different color than was advertised. Or, especially if it's really thirsty wood in some areas, sometimes you'll get some patchiness if you don't use that pre-stain or wood conditioner first. So I put a layer of that on. I like to just apply it using shop towels, the blue shop towels that you can get in the automotive section at like Canadian Tire, Home Depot, whatever. And I made sure as well to use an oil-based wood conditioner because I was going to be using an oil-based stain. If you do not already know, oil and water do not mix well, so if you're going to be using a water-based stain, like a gel stain, you're going to want to use a water-based wood conditioner or pre-stain as well, because if not, the two are not going to mesh well and you're going to get a poor product in the end, so make sure to do that. Now, if you're going to be using a top coat or a primer that is water or oil-based and you're using the opposite for your stain or for your paint, that is okay as long as you wait the proper amount of time in between. Typically, it's over 24 hours that you're going to have to let that layer thoroughly dry before going in with the opposite based product, if that makes sense. So keep that in mind as well, because that's an important thing that will result in a better finish. And so with this pre-stain, you put it on, you usually wait like 20 minutes, a half an hour, wipe away any remaining product that is sitting on the surface, and then you can go in with your stain. So you're not waiting for that to thoroughly dry. So I went in with this ebony stain, and it was definitely lighter than I had intended it to be or hoped that it would be. It looked darker in the container, but then once it was on there, it was like a kind of like a brown-based gray color, I would say. But the first layer isn't always what you're expecting, so I gave it the benefit of the doubt. I let it dry thoroughly, and then I went in with a second layer, and I could just tell by the time that that had dried that it was not looking how I had intended it to, that dark black, very deep tone. This was much more, again, kind of like a gray-based brown. And I knew that I would either have to do a ton of layers of stain or change my course of action. So I did some research into more black options of stain, and I actually found one by Varathane that was available at my Home Depot. So again, this was a new product to me. Could have went one of two ways. It ended up working out, thank God, but I did do some research into the product, making sure it would work well, making sure it had good reviews. This was actually a stain and poly in one, so that was also a newer product to me. But I do use Varathane stains, and I do like them, and I've had a good experience with them, so I figured it was pretty safe. So I applied this as well. And I did use a shop rag for the application because that's what I typically use for stains. However, it did recommend using a brush on the directions. So I might have gotten a more opaque finish early on if I had used that approach, but I was able to build it up in the end anyways after layering it a bit. And then that gave me a little bit more flexibility as well to really put the stain in the places that needed it a little bit more thickly. And I'm a big believer of building up finishes over multiple thinner coats rather than trying to get full coverage right off the bat with a thick, kind of gloopy coat that's going to take a lot longer to dry and may not even fully dry properly if it's a super thick coat anyways. So that was my mentality behind that. I would say I probably did 3 layers of this Varathane stain and poly, and it was in the color Classic Black, which was in a satin finish. And the reason that the satin finish was indicated is because it's also a poly mixed in there. So it actually had a really beautiful finish, a bit of a sheen to it, but not glossy in any way. And for dining tables, I always do recommend putting at least a satin finish on for a top coat. Oftentimes I find clients are wanting to do a matte top coat just because they like the look of that flat. They're not really trying to draw eyes to the table so much. They want to, put decor and different elements on it. That would be the focal point. But in order to withstand the wear and tear that a dining table or a kitchen table or something getting that daily use will need, I always recommend doing satin or more glossy because that matte finish isn't going to be able to hold up in that same way, in my experience. So this already had that built-in top coat, which was great. Anything with added durability is always great in my books. However, I do always make sure to add top coat, especially to a dining table or a kitchen table or something like that, that is going to be getting that repeated exposure to wear and tear, maybe to pets and children and things scraping along it and being thrown on it and backpacks and zippers and stuff like that. Like, just think about all the things that your dining table withstands day to day. So making sure that you're being really intentional with the products you're using and the finishes in those products, it's going to make the difference for that piece looking nice, but then, starting to really show that wear and tear within a couple of weeks or a couple of months versus lasting for years with very minimal change to that finish. So in between these coats of stain that I was applying, I also went back and addressed that strip around the table. So I went in with Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Coal Black, which was very similar looking to the stain that I was applying, which was great because Fusion has that built-in acrylic resin top coat. So it has just a little bit of a sheen to it compared to a chalk paint that looks very flat and matte. I find that Fusion has just a slight sheen to it, so it just reflects the light really beautifully and looks a little bit more modern in its finish, which I really enjoy, and that's one of the reasons why I choose it for the large majority of my makeovers. So I went through and applied that to this strip around the edge and let it dry thoroughly and lightly sanded in between each layer as well, just to make sure that I was getting the best finish. And I typically use a higher grit sandpaper when doing that. I would say around the 200 grit range because I'm not trying to get rid of any of the finish that I had just applied. I'm just trying to smooth everything out and make it all buttery soft for it to take the next layer of paint or the first layer of top coat. So once I had built that up, I think I did about 3 coats of paint and the stain had been looking good. I got ready to pull it all together with top coat. And something I should also mention, because this is a dining table that can be smaller to sit maybe like 6 people and then be opened up to have those leaves inserted into the middle. A lesson that I unfortunately learned the hard way on a previous custom dining table I had done. Thankfully, the clients were super understanding and let me go over and remedy the situation. But I had worked on the piece with it together. Or actually, no, I had worked on it apart, but then put the table together and the products had cured together. So when they went to open the table up to put the leaves in after a few days, basically everything was really sticky together and the finish pulled off of one side at that seam. So be aware of that if you're ever painting or even staining and then putting a top coat onto a table like that. Make sure that you open it up. It doesn't have to be fully open, but have it like an inch apart from the other side while you're working on it. And if you can avoid getting any products in those seams, that's probably the best way to avoid this happening. However, at a minimum, you want to keep those apart. And then during that curing time, which is 21 to 30 days, once you've completely finished the makeover, if that piece is going to be sitting in your space, keep it apart, keep the leaves out and separate, or at least have the leaves sitting in it and have there be space in between each of the pieces. And or if it's going to be going back to your client's home within that time frame, make sure that they're well aware that they need to keep it apart. They need to keep it from pushing up against the other pieces. They know the timeline for that, and they know the reason why, because ultimately they're going to want their piece to look as good as it's looking for the longest amount of time too, right? So they're going to be willing to sacrifice a few days of using the piece in order to be able to use it for years and years to come. But that's your responsibility as the furniture refinisher to educate them, because, some refinishers don't even know that that's the case, that it requires 21 to 30 days for these products to fully cure, to harden completely, and to be able to withstand wear and tear. So certainly a lot of our clients don't know it as well. So it's a matter of letting them know, whether you tell them verbally, whether you have a card that you include when you're dropping off the piece or it's being picked up, or you do both. At the end of the day, you're going to have a more satisfied customer if you let them know about that. So I encourage you to do so. So then it was time to top coat. I have been using and loving the Behr water-based top coat. I think it's called the fast drying water-based top coat. And although their matte version does have a slight sheen to it, which I actually do really like, I didn't want to use that and then possibly it didn't hold up against wear and tear. Also because this client has two very young children, like just had a baby, and I think her toddler's maybe 2. So I knew that over the next few years that table was going to see some shit. So I wanted there to be good durability, and so I opted to use the satin finish in that Behr polyurethane. And so I applied that with a roller because I find that that's giving me the best finish these days. Making sure, of course, to thoroughly stir that product for like a solid 30 seconds at least before I go in with the roller, because with the sediment and any little division there might be in the product, you want to make sure it's fully incorporated so that it looks its best and it performs its best as well. So I applied that. I want to say that I did a minimum of 3 coats, but I'm thinking it was 4 coats onto the table, onto the sides, onto that piece that I had painted. And I do that on all of my pieces. I want to make sure that they're very thoroughly and very properly protected. Could I just do 2 coats and then call it a day? Sure. But at the end of the day, it's my reputation as a business and giving a good product to my clients. And if it means having to take another couple days with drying time to get a few more coats added on there, I think it's well worth my time and product investment to do so, because it's going to last so much longer, and that's going to result in hopefully customers coming back because they're really happy with the product that they get and the long-term use that they get out of that product. And with this stain that I used in this instance, it did have a built-in poly, and that provided, those extra 3 or however many layers of added poly to that. So will be really surprised if she ever comes back to me and says that there are any issues with this table, because she protected. You really want that, again, with that high use, high traffic furniture, the top of a dresser, the top of a changing table, a dining table, a kitchen table, a side table, maybe in a family living room that gets a lot of use. All of these things, you really want to ensure that they're well protected, even more so than you're doing day to day with your pieces, because we're humans and we're not really paying attention as we move about this world, and a lot of us are clumsy, and so we need furniture to be able to withstand the messiness of being human. So once the top coat was applied, it was looking great. In between each layer of top coat, again, I'm lightly sanding once it has been thoroughly dried. Sanding with a high grit sandpaper around the 200 to 300 mark, just lightly to get rid of any bumps or any imperfections there might be in the finish before going in with that next layer. I do not sand after the final layer of polyurethane to keep that really clear, really beautiful finish. And then she was done. She was looking real cute. I then went through the same process on the dining table leaves. Was it an inefficient use of my time to do it that way? Yes, it absolutely was. However, I was restricted in my space, so whatever, you live and you learn. I had the dining table sitting on my dining table while I had the space in the workshop to work on the table leaves. So it all worked out. And the benefit being that once the table was done and the leaves were being worked on, which are much more portable than the huge heavy dining table that my husband and I could barely move ourselves, that I could, as I was building up those layers of stain, once those layers were dried, I could bring it inside and in different types of lighting, kind of compare that to the finish that I had gotten on the dining table, because I wanted it obviously to match and look seamless once they were all sitting side by each. But if I had done it the opposite way, I think it would have been a bit more of a pain in the ass. And ultimately doing them all at once would have avoided the need to do that anyways, but here we are. And sent some updated pictures, got a date for pickup scheduled, and then, as always with my custom orders, I get a little kind of goodie bag ready for the clients before pickup day, which has a handwritten thank you card, just thanking them for their business and for thinking of me and wishing them well in their endeavors with this piece of furniture. And if the piece has been painted, I'll always include a sample of extra paint in case it's ever needed. If, there's any issues during the transportation process, then they can just do those touch-ups. And I'll always include the name and the brand of paint as well in case they're ever wanting to get another piece done to match that or something like that, then they have access to that information. I also always provide 2 business cards, one so that they can keep it, and, if say the client came from another source and they weren't aware of my business explicitly, then it has, all my social media, my website, my email on there. And I always include a second business card in the hopes that clients will pass it along to people that they know, and then they can refer clients to get some more work done from me. I also include a care card, like I mentioned, telling them about the products and the curing time, best way to clean the pieces and maintain them long term, avoid any damage, and that kind of stuff. And if there's any hardware that came off of the piece that we switched out, there wasn't in this case, but, if we're doing a dresser or something and we're switching out the knobs, I'll always ask the client if they want those old knobs back, and I would include that in that little goodie bag as well. If they ever say, no, you can just toss them, then I always add those to my hardware stash for future projects because we are aiming to keep as much as we can out of the landfill. Of course, the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process, for me at least, is always when the client comes to pick up the piece or when they see it for the first time if I'm delivering it, because I can send the photos and whatever, but when you're seeing it in person, you're seeing it up close and personal. I always hope that it's going to be an overwhelmingly positive reaction. I don't think there's ever been anything but that, but you always get a little bit nervous of how are they going to like it? Did I do a good enough job? And it was actually her husband and his uncle that came and picked it up, and they loved it. They kept making remarks of how great it looked and how much better and more modern, so that always makes my heart super happy. When it got home and the client I had been interacting with was able to go and see it, she was also very happy. She sent me some updated photos once I got it into the home and styled a little bit, so that is always very much appreciated as well, because I can then add those to my portfolio, I can add those to my website, I can use those on my social media with their before and after photos and any testimonials that come from the client as well, to hopefully be able to get more business down the line. So that was my most recent custom refinishing project. Let me know how you like this kind of episode. For people who don't know the steps in doing a makeover, I hope this is helpful. If you are thinking about offering custom work, I hope it's helpful just to know kind of how it looks like when working with clients and what goes into that. If you ever have any questions, always feel free to reach out, send me an email, or send me a message on Instagram. I am always willing to help you guys out with your projects or answer any questions or suggest any products that I use and I love. It warms my heart so much to be able to help you guys out and then have you send the pieces when they're finished and see the transformation and see how proud you guys are of yourselves for doing this. I feel so much warmth in my heart for you for taking this on and trying out these new things and flipping your own furniture. It really does make my day. So don't be shy. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for your time, and I will catch you guys next time.